Okay, so now the slide is full screen? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So, today is our first organ system lecture. Is there anybody that has questions about anything other than today's lecture? Whether it's last week's lecture or exams or the lab or anything? Okay, that's good. So, again, with the first week of class, we had our levels of organization pyramid, and we started with the chemistry level, the atoms and the molecules. Then we put our molecules together to make cells. And then we took our cells, put them together to make tissues, which was last week. And now we are going to take the tissues, put them together to make organs, and take multiple organs, put them together into organ systems. So for the rest of the semester and probably all of next semester, you'll be learning about one organ system after another. You're going to see that we focus on some of them much more than others. Then I think I've mentioned before that the nervous system is going to get 3 whole lectures, and those are probably going to be 3 longer lectures. The muscle system is usually 1 long lecture. Today's is probably going to be kind of short. We are going to talk about the integumentary system. The integumentary system is primarily the skin, but it's also the things associated with the skin. We call them the accessory organs or the accessory structures. This is going to be things like the hair and the sweat glands and our fingernails and things like that. Things that are embedded in the skin. That is included in the integumentary system. So when we talk about the skin, and we're going to see this here, there are 3 primary layers. There's the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. When you look at skin, you are seeing the epidermis. The epidermis is on the outside. It is the most superficial layer of skin. And so on my arm, it is on top, and it is also on the bottom. So if we look at our diagram on the next slide, we see the epidermis is this little thin layer at the top. It really is not very thick. It's just a tiny fraction of the thickness of your skin. It is a keratinized, stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Always. There's nothing else that it can be. We have what we call thick and thin skin, and what determines whether something is thick or thin skin is thick skin has 1 extra layer in the epidermis. And we'll see those layers in a few slides. But thick skin is only in a couple of very specific places in our body. It is on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. Now, thinking about those 2 locations, what is unique about those 2 locations compared to the skin on the rest of our body? Why would we want thicker skin or an extra layer of skin in those 2 locations?
Because it's exposed, I guess, and we use our hands and feet a lot.
Yeah, so all of our skin is exposed, but like what you just said was we use our hands and our feet a lot. They're constantly touching things. You can do something to the palm of your hand that you don't get a problem with. That if you do the same thing to your back of your hand, you might cut it or you might scrape it or something like that. The soles of your feet, I mean, when you're born, it's nice soft skin, but by the time you're an adult, it's got all kinds of calluses and it's hard and it's ugly looking, right? We beat those parts of our body up, and so we're going to have an extra layer of in our epidermis there to protect it. Underneath the epidermis is the dermis, So that is going to make up this large, more darker pink, or I guess it's more of a medium pink here, that includes all of this other stuff. So the dermis is much larger than the epidermis. And the dermis has two layers. There's a papillary layer and a reticular layer, and we'll see these in a figure in a couple slides. But the papillary layer is going to be the upper part of the dermis. The reticular layer is going to be the lower layer. And then underneath the dermis, we have the hypodermis. So it's labeled here hypodermis. Now the hypodermis, even as simple as it may be, causes a lot of debate. Our textbook says that the hypodermis is not part of the skin. Other textbooks say it is part of the skin. Some textbooks also call it the subcutaneous layer, which if you work in the clinic at all, or you do anything about it with injections, that may be a familiar term to you. You might have heard of subcutaneous injections. A subcutaneous injection takes a needle and sticks it through the epidermis, through the dermis, into the subcutaneous layer down here. Now, again, I'm a very practical person. It seems to me hypodermis should have been included as part of the skin. I mean, to lump the epidermis and the dermis together in one layer, that's just an artificial thing that somebody decided. Why not include the hypodermis? Because underneath the hypodermis is either bone or muscle. At that point, you're very much definitely not the skin. And so why not include the hypodermis in the skin? But that's the boat that I am in. That's my argument. However, we use this textbook, and this textbook does not include the hypodermis as part of the skin. It is mostly adipose tissue. So if we look at this diagram here, we see these little fluffy, they look like marshmallows. Those are adipocytes. Those are the cells in the adipose tissue. We have a layer of fat underneath our skin. It has nothing to do with energy storage. This is for just a little bit added protection, a little, what's the word I'm looking for? Shock absorption under our skin. So here we see the layers of the epidermis. So remember, the epidermis is the outermost layer of our skin. And even though it was not very thick, if you zoom in on it, you see that there are actually quite a few different sub-layers there. So we're going to start on the outside. The outermost layer of the epidermis is the stratum corneum. These are dead cells, and they are filled with keratin. Both of those ideas are important. They are dead cells. The outermost part of our skin is dead cells. That's something you probably already knew. We know that we slough off dead skin constantly, right? That is coming from the stratum corneum, and they are filled with keratin. And remember, our skin is a stratified or keratinized squamous stratified. I messed that all up. Keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Clearly, there's more than one layer here, right? And the outermost layer of cells is flat, and so it's squamous. As we move up in our skin, or in our epidermis, we get the cells that are dead. At the bottommost layer, which we haven't gotten to yet, that is where the cells are alive. And as we get further and further and further up, the cells get less and less alive. What happens is cells are made at the bottom here, and as they get made, they push the old cells up. So it's a progression. As the cell gets older, they move up the layers of the epidermis, and they get less and less alive. By the time they get to the stratum corneum, they are completely dead. Underneath the stratum corneum is the stratum lucidum. Now, the stratum lucidum is the layer that defines the difference between thick skin and thin skin. This stratum lucidum is only present in thick skin. It is not present in thin skin. That means if I ask you a question like, what part of our body can you find the stratum lucidum? You would say the palms of your hand or the soles of your foot. If you said anything other than that, you would get it wrong. Now, if you look at the word lucidum, the first part of that word is lucid. Does anybody know what the word lucid means? Where do you hear the word lucid?
Like to be coherent or something?
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah. And so you're definitely correct. Can anybody think of a situation where we use the word lucid to describe something that we're very aware of what's going on?
Like lucid dreaming?
Exactly. Yes. Lucid dreaming. Thank you. So in lucid dreams, those are the dreams where you are very, very aware of what's going on, and maybe you can actually control what's going on. Lucid means clear. And so those are very clear dreams. So the stratum lucidum is actually a clear layer in the skin, which is where it got its name from. Underneath that, we have the stratum granulosum. And again, this has a name that is descriptive. If we look at it, we see there's all these little specks in them. Those specks are called lamellar granules. That is not a term you need to know. But I do suggest that you know that the stratum granulosum gets its name because it has all of these little specks in it. And I'm sure you can connect in your mind that a granule would look like a speck. Underneath that, we have the stratum spinosum. This is the thickest layer of the epidermis. This is made up of keratinocytes. Keratinocytes are cells that make keratin. So in reality, all of these layers above the stratum spinosum are also made of keratinocytes. It's just down here in the stratum spinosum, they are very much alive. And then as we go up, we get more and more dead keratinocytes. Stratum spinosum gets its name because the cells under a microscope sometimes look spiny. We can't see that in this picture, and so that's not going to help you remember. But the stratum spinosum is underneath the granulosum. And then the bottommost layer, the deepest layer of the skin, is the stratum basale. Think basement, B-A-S. That's at the bottom. And the stratum basale is the only layer of skin here where the cells are actually dividing and growing. No new cells are made anywhere other than the stratum basale. So they're made at the bottom, and as they're made, they push the old cells up until eventually they flake off as dead skin cells. We see a couple of other skin cells here, a melanocyte and a Merkel cell. They are in the stratum basale, but we'll talk more about those cells on a later slide. And we see underneath the stratum basale is the dermis, because the stratum basale is the bottommost layer of the epidermis. So here's a question for you. What is the most superficial layer of the epidermis? B. I hear somebody say stratum corneum. What does the word superficial mean?
Close to the surface.
Yes, close to the surface. And so with our epidermis, we're looking for the outermost layer, which was the stratum corneum. And for that one, I forgot to talk about its name. Where do you, if you look at the word corneum, what jumps out at you? What looks familiar?
Corns.
You're being you're actually being more practical than me here. Yes, we're talking about skin. We get corns on our feet. That doesn't help us know where this word comes from, though. Actually,
I don't know. Okay.
you know, I never thought I never thought of this. I've never had a corn. I actually don't even really know what a corn is. But maybe a corn is a buildup of the stratum corneum. I don't know. I could be completely wrong. I'm not going to take the time to look it up now. But you can look it up. You're probably doing it right now because I'm not looking at your screen. But don't quote me on it. But where else what else does the word corneum look like? Think about your eye. Your
I
eye.
was gonna say that, but I was like, that doesn't make any sense.
What were you going to say?
The eye, but I just thinking of skin, like that just didn't make any sense.
But why? What's the connect? Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say the same thing, like thinking of the cornea.
Cornea, yes. The cornea of the eye is the outermost layer of your eye. So think cornea, corneum, they're always on the outside. Okay, so let's talk more about the cell types that are found in the epidermis. We already talked about the keratinocytes. They make keratin and they provide protection. They provide protection by making keratin, but also they're like a sacrificial layer of cells here. They don't have any purpose other than serving as protection. And so if they get damaged, no harm, no foul. And at least in terms of us as a organism. Yes, those cells, but they're just cells. The stem cells make the new cells. So the stem cells are found at the very bottom in the stratum basale. They are going to divide and primarily make keratinocytes. But they can also make these other cells as well. Another type of cell here are the melanocytes. Remember, we saw melanocytes in that diagram, and they were also in the stratum basale. Melanocytes make melanin. We know melanin gives our skin tone the color it is. We'll talk more about skin tone later on, so we'll talk more about melanin later. But melanocytes make melanin. We have Merkel cells, which are also tactile cells. It just depends on where you're reading about it. Are they naming it after its function, tactile or feeling, or are they naming them after the person, Merkel, that discovered them? But they are for sensing touch. Then we have dendritic cells, also called Langerhans cells. These are like white blood cells. They go around looking for invaders, whether they be viruses or fungus or bacteria, and they swallow them up. We talked about phagocytosis when we talked about our cells, and we said that phagocytosis is the process of bringing in large structures into the cell. So that's what a dendritic or Langerhans cell does. It is actually going to move through the cells. So if I go back to our diagram, actually it's not in this one, but a Langerhans or a dendritic cell can actually kind of work its way through all the little cracks here. And it's just going to spend its time patrolling, looking for something that doesn't belong there. And when it finds it, it's just going to eat it. It's going to take it in, digest it, break it down, and kill it. We also have Meissner's corpuscles. So this is one that you will see in your lab. So in the lab, we call it a Meissner's corpuscle, not a corpuscle of touch. A Meissner's corpuscle is for very light touch. And so think of this as a sensor that will tell you, are you touching something or are you not touching it? So if I take my hand and I just touch the desk, I can tell I'm touching it. I don't have to push very hard. I just know I'm touching it. But if I push harder, the Meissner's corpuscles don't change the signal that they're sending. They're an on or off switch. They tell you you're touching something or you're not touching something. The kind of pair to go with the Meissner's corpuscle is the Pacinian corpuscle that's at the bottom of our list. These sense pressure. These are the ones that tell us how hard are we pushing on the desk. And so the way I remember it, pressure starts with P, Pacinian starts with P. And so Pacinian corpuscles are for pressure, and so by process of elimination, Meissner's must be for light touch. Along those same lines, in terms of sensing the world around us, we have free nerve endings. Now this is not a cell that just sits there. Actually, let's talk about the Meissner corpuscle a little bit more here. So here we can see it. It is sitting down here in the very uppermost part of the dermis. And so that's a little ways into your skin. That's why it only kicks in if you start to put more pressure on. If you just set your hand on something, your skin's not going to push in enough to cause the Meissner corpuscle to feel it. Okay. So back to the free nerve endings. So this is a nerve that runs, think about a nerve running down my whole arm, and then it comes to the tip of my finger, and then it just takes these little projections, so they look like little fingers that come out of the nerve, and they kind of work their way up into the skin, the epidermis, and the dermis. These are going to sense temperature and pain. The ones that sense pain are nociceptors. The ones that sense temperature are thermoreceptors, but I don't require you to know those two names. You have to know free nerve endings, and you have to know that free nerve endings sense pain and temperature. And so if you put your hand on something hot, number one, the thermoreceptors are going to say that's hot. And if you leave it there too long, now the nociceptors are going to say, now this temperature is painful. You need to remove your hand off of whatever is hot. Also in the skin, in the dermis, we have a hair bulb. This is where we're going to make our hair. We'll see more about this later on. Hair bulb is not a type of cell, but we have several different types of cells that are going to make up the hair bulb. And then we have glands. And we'll talk about each individual gland later on. But we have three primary ones. We have merocrine and eccrine glands, which are sweat glands, and sebaceous glands, which are oil glands. So next, we talked about the epidermis. We've talked about the cells. Let's move down a little bit lower into the dermis. Now, the dermis is where most of the magic is going to happen. The epidermis is very thin. And if I go back, I think it's quite a few layers. If I look here, what can you tell me about blood vessels in the epidermis and the dermis by looking at this diagram? The blood vessels are the blue and red squiggly lines.
What do you mean? Sorry.
So, do you see the blood vessels in the diagram?
Yes.
Where are they located?
They're in the dermis.
They're in the dermis. Only in the dermis. They do not go up into the epidermis at all. Which means the epidermis gets very little blood flow because the only blood that can get up to it, the only nutrients that can get up to the epidermis is blood that leaks out of the blood vessels here in the dermis and then works its way up. That is the large reason why as you go up the epidermis, the cells die. Because as they go further up, they get further and further away from these blood vessels and they don't get the nutrients they need to survive. And so because there's so little blood flow or nutrients in the epidermis, all of the other things associated with our skin, where the hair is made, the sweat glands, the corpuscles, they're all going to be down in the dermis. You know, I just realized, I think I talked about this one wrong. I got it backwards in my head. I think I was talking, when I talked about this slide, I said this was going to sense deep pressure. And that's not the case. Because it is right up by the epidermis, do you see this dark line here? That is the stratum basale. And so that is the line between the epidermis and the dermis. And so the Meissner's corpuscle, which is actually the light touch corpuscle, is right up by the epidermis. Whereas if we go back and look at this diagram, we see the Pacinian corpuscle, which is in fact for deep or hard pressure, is much deeper down in the dermis. I apologize for that. So the dermis has... Go ahead. Does somebody have a question? No.
Sorry, I'm muted. I just realized that.
Okay.
So for the Meissner corpuscle, the thing that the arrow is pointing to, that's the corpuscle, right?
Yeah, it's this little egg. Do you see the little egg-shaped thing?
Yeah.
That's the corpuscle. Yeah.
Got it. In this dark purple line, that's the stratum basale.
Correct.
Okay.
And that is actually, it's one cell layer thick.
Okay.
And everything above that is the epidermis.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. So if we look at dermis, there are two layers here. We have a papillary layer and we have a reticular layer. Now, if you look at this, and on the other diagram, I said the dark purple line was the stratum basale. On this slide, if you look for a dark purple line, you're going to look at this, and that is actually not the stratum basale here. The stratum basale is the bottommost layer of cells in this darker pink layer. Does everybody see there's this very loose looking layer up here, the dead cells, and then here there's this medium pink layer that it looks like live cells. Those are the bottom layers, bottom few layers of the epidermis, probably the spinosum and the basale. And then there's a very clear change. We go from medium pink to light pink, and it's immediate. There's no gradual change. It's like somebody flipped a switch. When you go from that medium pink to the light pink, that is where we go into the dermis. And if you look at the dermis and notice the part up here, up by the epidermis, it just looks different than the dermis down below. It's much tighter packed. The papillary layer is much tighter packed than the reticular layer down below. And you notice that the epidermis likes to stick down and the dermis likes to stick up. And so what we get is this wave shape. Now these, where the dermis comes up, is called a dermal papilla. Where the epidermis comes down, it's not labeled on here, that is an epidermal ridge. And so we have epidermal ridges that come down, and then the dermal papilla comes up. This word here, papilla, is plural. If you put the E on it, it's plural. If you take the E off, it is singular. And so it's papilla, both singular and plural, but you spell it a little bit differently each way. And these epidermal ridges and dermal papilla are actually what give us our fingerprints. So if you look at your finger and you see your fingerprints, you see, they go like this, right? That is these dermal papilla and the epidermal ridges going along. Now we have these papilla and ridges everywhere on our skin. And so why do you think we only have fingerprints and toe prints? Why do we not have fingerprint type structures all over our arms and our legs and everything like that? What's different in our skin and our feet, do you think?
I'm just gonna guess, but is it for gripping?
Yes. Yes. And so we grip things with our fingers and our toes. And so we have these extra little ridges that provide some extra friction. Now looking at this picture, I said we have the ridges and the papilla everywhere. And so why do we only have the visible fingerprints on our hands and our feet? What's different about the skin that causes that, do you think?
It's that additional layer of skin? Is that the...
No, it's simpler than that.
Oh.
Is it like pressure on our feet?
Simpler. So if we look at this diagram, if you wanted to, let's say that this picture is looking at skin on my arm. If you looked at that same type of slide on the skin on my finger, what would look different, do you think?
If it was like your hands or your fingers, it would have like hair follicles or something.
Simpler. So let's just focus on the ridges and the papilla. What would be different about those? Really, really simple.
Would it just be straight across? I have no idea. Yeah.
So I think you're on the right track. You're looking at it backwards, though. So in our fingers, in our toes, the papilla and the ridges are bigger. And so it goes like this rather than like this. And so in reality, we actually do have this pattern everywhere. It's just not big enough to actually see. So I didn't realize that was going to be so complicated. So next, let's talk about skin color. We have a few different things that determine our skin color. We have three primary pigments. And the most obvious one, the one that everybody knows about, is melanin. This is what gives us the brownish color, whether it is a person who is normally light-skinned that becomes tan, or someone who is naturally, genetically, going to have darker skin. This is usually going to have a brownish color to it, but it doesn't always. We actually have a few different types of melanin, including eumelanin and pheomelanin, which you don't need to know those subnames, but they can actually have slightly different colors. Some of them are kind of a yellowish color. But this melanin is the primary thing that controls our skin color. What's going to determine our skin color is how much melanin do we make and where does that melanin go. And so we'll see that in a probably on the next slide. But melanin is not the only thing that controls our skin color. We also have a pigment called keratin, which is orangish or kind of an orange red. Where do you know this word from? Keratin.
I think of carrot
Yes, you do. You're correct. And why do you think carrot?
because of the color.
Because of the color. Does anybody know? There's a vitamin that's in carrots.
Beta carotene.
Beta carotene. Yeah. So
Yeah.
carrots are orange because they have a lot of keratin. Now, the keratin in the carrot is no different than the keratin here that our body makes. And it is actually possible to eat so many carrots that your skin turns orange. It happens. People go on these fad diets and they eat just pounds and pounds of carrots every day, and their skin literally turns orange like an Oompa Loompa. Now, let me ask you this. I'm not a big fan of carrots. I prefer Cheetos. Why do you think if I eat a whole bunch of Cheetos, my skin's not going to turn orange? Now, I don't know it won't. My hypothesis is that it won't. Why do you think that is?
Because the orange color in Cheetos is synthetic. It's not.
Yes. And so when our body takes it in, what do you think is going to happen to it?
Just get rid of it.
It's going to get rid. It's going to break it down. It's going to digest it.
Right.
Keratin is our body said, hey, this is something I make. You know, it's like going to a garage sale and saying, hey, you know, I could use that. Let me just take it home and use it as it is. And so it just absorbs all of it, and then it goes in our skin and we turn orange. Finally, we have hemoglobin. What is hemoglobin?
Blood protein.
Yes, and specifically what blood protein?
Red.
Yeah, it is the protein in our body that makes the blood red. So hemoglobin, when it has oxygen on it, that's what its job is. It carries oxygen. It is red in color. We get blood in our skin, or at least directly under our epidermis, in our dermis, and so we can see that. Someone who is light-skinned doesn't have a lot of melanin blocking the hemoglobin that's deeper in the skin, and so we can see it a little bit more. Someone who has more melanin, the melanin just blocks the hemoglobin underneath, and so you're not going to see it nearly as much. And so this is what gives people a kind of a pink appearance on the cheeks sometimes, or if someone gets embarrassed and they blush, that's just a flushing of blood into the cheeks, and then you can actually see that blood through the skin. So this is the melanin. So we're looking at the epidermis here, and the melanocytes are in the stratum basale. So I just saw that question, and I will answer that about the sun and our skin color. And so melanocytes are down here in the stratum basale, and melanocytes make melanin. Now I'm going to tell you something. It may seem weird, may not be your first instinct, is that me, who is about as I'm a pale dude. Let's put it that way. I have the same number of melanocytes as someone who has dark skin. It's just my melanocytes don't make as much melanin as the melanocytes in the person who has darker skin. And the melanin that my cells make stay down right by the melanocytes. So in this figure, we see two slices of skin, one from a person with dark skin, one from a person with light skin. And you can see all these little specks here are the melanin. And so clearly, there is far more melanin on the left than on the right. There's only a few of them here in the light skin. and the ones that are in the light skin are down right in or next to the melanocyte. Whereas in the dark-skinned person, the melanin actually comes up towards the surface, and it's much more visible. That come back to the question. Somebody asked, how does the sun affect our skin color? And so looking at this figure, what do you think happens when we get tanned?
Do the melanocytes just kind of rise to the surface? Or?
So melanocytes cannot move. They're stuck in the stratum basale.
Melon.
But what can move? I think somebody said it.
The melanin?
Yeah, the melanin can move. And so when we are exposed to sun, the melanocytes make more melanin, and that melanin then starts moving up closer to the surface. Now I'm glad you asked this question. I'm not sure if I mentioned it or not, but before I went to grad school, I worked for a couple of years at a chemical company, and what I did is I made sunscreen. And so I'm always harping on people about being safe with the sun, and if we ever have time or you're interested, I have a quick little lecture about sunscreen and everything like that. But to boil it down, the process of tanning is your body's response to DNA damage. If we get hit by UV rays, our DNA gets damaged, our body is able to sense that, and so it tells the melanocytes to make more melanin. Now, what do you know about DNA damage? Well, what can DNA damage cause? Cancer, yes. And so you being tan is a sign that you were exposed to carcinogen in UV rays. And so people go around laying out in the sun, paying money to lay in a bed to expose themselves to carcinogens so that they can walk around having evidence by darker skin saying, hey, look at me, I'm going to get skin cancer. It just doesn't make sense. Don't do it. Don't do it. So we have some skin colors that we consider abnormal. And so these are not a color that a person would normally be. And so if we see a person this color, we can draw conclusions about what may be wrong with that person, why they might be sick. So one of them is called pallor, which just means that they are pale. And so if someone is pale, we generally think of they're white. I mean, they're white. And so I have kind of pale skin normally, but you can see the hemoglobin, the red underneath. And so I have a little bit of a pinkish hue. If I become pale, my skin's going to go white. And that's because the red blood cells that should be there aren't there. Now, number one, they may have just moved temporarily for one reason or another. But it could also be a sign that I am anemic, meaning I don't have as many red blood cells as I'm supposed to have, which can be caused by a lot of things, but it's a very visible sign that something is wrong. Another color that we can see is actually blue. This is called cyanosis. If somebody has blue skin, we say that they are cyanotic. This is a situation where we have the blood that we need, and it is where it needs to be. There's just no oxygen on that blood. And again, there could be a lot of reasons why that could be. Number one, it could be they're not breathing properly. And so if you're not breathing properly, you're not getting enough oxygen into your blood. And so your red blood cells just don't have the oxygen. And when hemoglobin doesn't have oxygen, it is blue in color. But we can also become cyanotic through poisoning. And that's where the term cyanosis comes from cyanide, which is a poison you've probably heard of That's what the spies like to use in the movies. But what cyanide does is it will actually kick oxygen off of red blood, off of hemoglobin, so the oxygen can't be there. So that's how it kills you. It causes you to suffocate, basically inside from the inside out. Your blood cell can't get oxygen, and so you die. Something like carbon monoxide could cause the same thing. Carbon monoxide kills you the same way. It binds to your hemoglobin and prevents the oxygen from doing it. So, kind of an example of this. A few years ago, I got the flu. It was the actual flu. Fortunately, it was not what we have going around now. But apparently, unbeknownst to me, while I had the flu and I was at home getting over the flu, I got pneumonia. And I had never had pneumonia or the flu before. I didn't know what was normal, what was not normal. And so one night, I'm sitting at home and I'm feeling really, really crappy. And I noticed my lips turned blue. And I thought, I have a high fever. I feel like I'm freezing. When we get cold, so when somebody gets cold, their lips turn blue because our body is taking the blood and putting it internal to preserve our body heat. And so I assumed incorrectly in the end that my body was doing the same thing. I felt cold, and so I was pulling the blood in, and so my blue lips I wasn't too concerned about. Eventually, I got in bad enough shape, I went into the emergency room, and it turned out my blood oxygen level was really, really low. That's why my lips were blue, and you could see it under my fingernails, because my blood oxygen level was very, very low, because I wasn't breathing properly. Over time, my blood oxygen level continued to drop, and I got low blood oxygen levels. Finally, the last abnormal skin color that we have is jaundice. This is a yellow color. You can see the yellowness in the skin, but you can also see it in the eyes. There are two primary, jaundice always comes from liver failure. We have a protein, or it's not a protein. We have a chemical in our body called bilirubin, which is yellow. It's a result of breakdown of red blood cells. You'll learn about where bilirubin comes from, and it also leads to why your urine is yellow and why your feces are brown. It's all kind of a fascinating little connected thing. But when it's in our blood, it is yellow, and our liver breaks it down. And so we're constantly making this yellow bilirubin, and our liver breaks it down. If we have liver failure, though, we can't break it down, and it builds up. Now, in the US, we have two primary reasons for liver failure. One of them is alcoholism. People who drink a lot, their liver starts to fail. The other is young age. And this is actually a very common thing for newborns. Does anybody have experience they'd like to share with a newborn and jaundice?
Yeah, my son had a little bit of that when he was first born, and they put him under a light or something.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so when kids are born, we're all born at slightly different levels of development. I mean, even if someone is born at term, not premature, I may have a more developed heart and a less developed liver. Somebody else may have a more developed liver and a less developed heart. And so what happens, if you're born with a slightly less developed or an underdeveloped liver, you can't break down this bilirubin. And so like she said, they took her kid and they put the newborn under a light. That was a light that mimics the sun. Kind of interestingly, sunlight will break down bilirubin. So bilirubin that's in the skin, if you put the child in sunlight, they will the jaundice will go away. The sun will break down the bilirubin. You take the kid in, and then later on, you put them back under the light. It seems strange, but not that those solar lights were not invented all that long ago. They used to literally take a child and put them on a windowsill and let them sit there in the sun until they were no longer jaundiced, and then they would bring them back inside. But it's a very simple fix. I mean, the bilirubin itself doesn't hurt anything unless it gets really, really, really high. And if you're noticing a child has jaundice, either in the skin or the eyes, it's probably not to the point of being harmful yet. And so you just occasionally use sunlight to break down the bilirubin. Elsewhere in the world, hepatitis is a much larger problem than it is in the US. I don't know if we have anyone that is from Asia or has traveled to Asia, but hepatitis is a very, very big problem in Asia. I mean, it's really a big deal. It's really surprising how here in the US we've managed to keep it under control, primarily through vaccination. But hepatitis is a virus, or there are hepatitis viruses that cause hepatitis. And hepatitis is simply an inflammation of the liver. That's what hepatitis means. And anything itis means inflammation. Hepa refers to the liver. So hepatitis is liver inflammation. That is, your liver is not going to function properly. And so people who have hepatitis will become jaundiced. So here's a question. Liver dysfunction, which skin color would we have? B, jaundice. And what color would that be? What color would that be? Yellow. Yeah. So let's take a 5-minute break here. Looks like it's 6:57. We'll come back like 7:02, 7:03, somewhere in there. So for those of you that are still sticking around, I have some bad news to share with you, and that is I am not going to be fishing after class today. So we got all that rain over the weekend. Sunday night, I went out about 9 o'clock at night as it was getting dark, and I pumped all the water out of the boat. It was dry, and Monday morning, I got up, I looked out the window, and the boat was sunk. Currently, the boat is on the bottom of the lake next to the dock, and I'm still trying to figure out how to get it up and out. I have no idea what happened.
My husband's in the back, kind of giggling at the situation. And I'm like, babe, how would you like if it was your boat? Or your car?
Luckily, it's just a little aluminum boat. My big expensive boat sits in the driveway. Nothing is getting hurt. Well, I have a battery and a trolling motor, and I had a solar panel and a charger and everything. I've gotten all those out. Right now, it's just an aluminum boat sitting on the bottom of the lake. I don't have any idea. Either the plug popped out or one of the welds broke. But I don't know why either one of them would have happened in the middle of the night when it wasn't raining and it wasn't windy. But I won't know until I figure out some way to get a sunken boat up out of the water. So I'm still working on that.
Oh, I wish you best of luck with that. It sounds stressful.
Is there anybody in the class that's from somewhere quite a ways away. Was there anybody kind of in the Panhandle or Alabama, Louisiana that were more affected by the storm, or is everybody pretty local?
Pretty local. Does rain help you fish?
So I had been wanting rain because our lake is a very shallow lake, and it was starting to get pretty darn shallow, and so I was wanting rain to bring it up. The rain itself normally doesn't help unless when the water comes up, maybe the weeds around the edge of the lake where the fish want to be, if the water's too low, they can't be there. And so then they just kind of spread out over the whole lake. Whereas if there's enough water in the weeds, the fish will concentrate in the weeds and it's easier to find them.
Oh, I'm just curious. Every time it looks like droplets or something. I don't know. It's weird. I try to fish my uncle and figure out why is this a good fishing day.
So usually, and I don't have a good explanation. I've looked. I don't think anybody has a good explanation for it. But it's generally considered when we have a dropping atmospheric pressure that the fishing is better. And that happens when a front is coming through. And usually we get rain when fronts go through. Here in Florida in the summer, our storms are not associated with a front. They just kind of pop up out of nowhere. But in the winter and the spring, we get the fronts that come through, and that's like a cold front or a warm front, and that causes the barometric pressure to drop. And the fishing tends to be better as the pressure is dropping. But once the front goes through, it's not any good anymore. So let's pick up where we just left off. And so we were about to talk about the hair. Now remember, the hair is considered part of the integumentary system. It is buried in our skin. This diagram shows it kind of half in the dermis, half down in the hypodermis, the subcutaneous layer. You may see another diagram where it's completely up here in the dermis. That's not really important. I just need you to realize it is not in the epidermis. It will stick up through the epidermis, but down here where it's actually growing is down below the epidermis. And we have a few different terms that we use to describe this whole structure. So number one, we have the hair shaft. This is the hair. When you think of as hair, yes, this is hair. This isn't a wig or anything like that. That's actual hair. That is the hair shaft. That is the part that comes up and sticks out above the skin. We have a hair root. The root is the bottommost part of the shaft. And so we can see in the diagram here, it comes down through the epidermis, through the dermis, into this little bulb here at the bottom. And in that bulb, we can see there's the base of the shaft in the center there. That is the root. This is where the hair is going to grow from. Hair grows from the bottom. If we add more to the bottom, it pushes the old stuff up and out. The hair follicle is the hole or the tube in the skin where the hair shaft will come up out through. And so it's not going to burrow its way through cells. There's a tube running through the skin that the hair shaft is going to be in. That's the hair follicle. At the bottom, we have this wider area. I call that the bulb. That is the hair bulb. That is, if we follow the shaft down, or the follicle, it gets wider at the bottom. That is the hair bulb. The matrix, the hair matrix, is the actual location, the exact spot where the growth occurs. And that is at the very, very, very bottom of the hair shaft. And so we see that the bottom of the hair shaft, we have a wider area. That is the root. But the very, very bottom tip of it is the matrix. And that is where the growth is going to occur. Every time we make a new cell, a new hair cell, here, it's going to push an old one up. And so the hair is going to move up one cell at a time. Our hair is actually made out of keratinocytes, just like the outer part of our skin. It is dead keratinocytes and a whole bunch of keratin that they made. The papilla are these blood vessels right here. So these are blood vessels that come up and they touch the matrix. They touch the base of that hair. And so they're going to supply the nutrients needed to make the new cells. And finally, we have the erector pili muscle. Another term for this is the piloerector muscle. This is muscle right here. One end is buried in the skin, in the dermis. The other end is going to attach to the hair follicle. And this is actually what gives you the goosebumps. And so when the hair stands up, that is actually this erector pili muscle that pulls on that hair follicle, makes it straighten up, causes the hair to stand up, and causes the little bumps in your skin. So, where are the blood vessels? What is the term for the location here that the blood vessels were in?
C.
Yes. That is the papilla. That was right here. And we have red and blue. This is just a convention that we use for blood vessels everywhere, where the red blood vessels are bringing the blood to something and the blue blood vessels are carrying it away. And so the blood comes up the red and then back down through the blue.
I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
So looking back at the diagram, the hair shaft is that the part that's sticking out of the skin, or is that just like?
So it's the part that sticks out of the skin, but it also that goes down into your skin as well. And so it's.
Brown spot?
Can you say that last part again?
It's like the brown stuff in this diagram. It kind of like goes. It's out of the skin and then goes kind of in.
Yeah, but in the diagram, it's brown and then it turns kind of a grayish color.
Yeah.
And so, if you imagine, I'm sure at some point you've seen a hair pulled out. You've pulled a hair out of yourself, right?
Yeah.
And so you know that there's a part of it that was buried down in your skin.
Right.
That is still hair shaft.
Gotcha.
So it's the visible part and the invisible part, but it's all one piece.
Okay. That makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. So next we talk about the glands. We have two primary types of glands. We have sweat glands and oil glands. For the sweat glands, the technical term is sudoriferous glands. And we have two types of sudoriferous or sweat glands. We have eccrine sweat glands, which are also called merocrine sweat glands. Those are interchangeable terms. and we have apocrine sweat glands. Yeah, we'll talk more about the eccrine and the apocrine. They have their own slides. And then we have our sebaceous glands, which make oil, and they have their own slide also. So we're going to start with the eccrine or merocrine sweat glands. When you think of sweat, this is what you're thinking of. You're thinking of eccrine or merocrine sweat. And that comes from the eccrine or merocrine sweat glands. These release sweat. It is basically salt water. When you walk outside in the summer and you start sweating, you get covered in sweat. It's basically just salt water, and that came from this eccrine sweat gland. I want you to look at this diagram and notice that the eccrine sweat glands come up and touch the outside world. They have their own little pore. They have pores on our skin that the sweat comes out of. And that is the only function of those pores. That's going to be different than the apocrine sweat glands. So the eccrine sweat or merocrine sweat glands make just normal sweat, and they have their own pores. The apocrine sweat glands are different. They don't dump out directly to the surface. They actually dump their sweat onto or into a hair follicle. And so that sweat will actually come up around the hair shaft, through the follicle. The sweat that comes from an apocrine sweat gland also contains lipid or fat in it. The other sweat was just salt water. This is salt water that has lipids in it. These are found almost exclusively in the armpits and groin. Now let's focus on armpits. What can you tell me is a very well-known fact about armpits?
It's hairy.
Yeah, it's hairy. Yeah, okay. What else?
Smells.
They smell, right? Armpits smell. Because there are apocrine sweat glands there. Lipids, so the smell is primarily from bacteria that eat the lipid, and then they give off a smell. The rest of our skin doesn't have the lipid, and bacteria they can't live on salt water. There's no nutrients there for them. And so when you go exercise, or you just go outside and you live in Florida and you sweat, that doesn't necessarily really make you all that smelly. The smelliness comes from the sweat in your armpits. The deodorant commercials like to talk about stress sweat. Stress sweat, we actually do sweat when we get stressed, but a lot of that stress sweat comes from these apocrine sweat glands in our armpits. And so when you get stressed, you may see somebody with a wet underarm, and they may start to smell because there's this lipid and the bacteria start eating it. Now, you have to remember the difference between the eccrine, merocrine, and the apocrine sweat glands. You have to know which one is which. The way I remember this is that apocrine sweat glands make you smell like an ape. So if you can remember, apocrine sweat glands make you smell like an ape. These must be the ones that have the lipid, and they're the ones in your armpit. And by process of elimination, the merocrine or eccrine sweat glands are the other ones that just give off normal sweat and don't make you smell. Questions about sweat glands?
Just a weird question. So I heard, there's like wives' old tales, and one time I was told that if you like cut a potato and put it under their arms, it does something. Is there some kind of scientific thing you might know about that?
I've never heard that before. Well, what's it supposed to do?
The white potato, it's supposed to cut the smell. When kids are going through puberty, So they said what they used to do is cut a white potato and rub under their arms, and it helped. It's it.
My best guess is
I don't know.
maybe there's some sort of antibiotic effect from the potato, and so it prevents the bacteria from growing. I don't know. Interesting.
Yeah, I'm too curious.
Did anybody actually ever do that?
No, I did. My kids grandma told me to do it, but I just got some deodorant.
Yeah, consider they sell big things of deodorant at the dollar store. I don't think there's a use to use potatoes anymore.
Yeah, she was old school. I just got them some deodorant.
So the last type of gland in the skin, we have lots of other glands, but the last type of gland in the skin are sebaceous glands. These make our skin oil. Now, some people have oily skin, some people have more dry skin, but we all have some of this oil. It's just, do you get slippery and shiny, or do you stay all nice looking? And we have higher concentrations of sebaceous glands in some locations in our body. We have a lot of them on our face and not that many on places like our arm. So sebaceous gland, like I said, it makes the skin oil, and it, like the apocrine sweat gland, dumps its secretion into the hair follicle. And so this oil is going to come up through the hair follicle onto the surface of the skin. They do not have their own pore. The technical term for the skin oil is sebum. So, has anybody ever heard or used something called lanolin? It's a skin cream. It's not used all that often anymore. It used to be more common. No? I hope you haven't, because once I tell you this, you're probably going to wish you hadn't, or be glad that you didn't. So lanolin is actually sebum from sheep. They take sheep skin oil and they put it in a tube and they sell it. People used to use this as skin lotion before Vaseline came around. They would actually take the oil from a sheepskin and put it on your own skin to help moisturize your skin. But now we have Vaseline and all kinds of other fancy things, and we don't have to use sheep anymore. But if you look, you can actually still buy lanolin. Next, we'll talk about our nails. So this is our fingernails and toenails. These are part of our integumentary system. And in reality, all they really are specialized hairs. Structurally, there is no difference between my fingernail and my hair, other than my hair has some melanin mixed in with it. The melanin makes my hair brown. When I get old, and I will admit there's a few of them on either side, and the hair starts to turn gray, the hair is the same. There's just no longer any melanin in the hair. But the nails, they're just very wide hairs, basically. We have several terms to talk about here. The first is the free edge. The free edge is the part that sticks past your finger, the part that is not directly attached to your finger. That's the part that you trim. That's the part hanging over the end here. The body is the part of your fingernail that is attached to your finger and is kind of clear. And so you're going to see your reddish or your skin color underneath that. That is the body. The cuticle, actually, I'm going to skip the cuticle, come back to the lanula. The lanula is that weird little white half moon at the bottom of your finger, of your base of your fingernail. The cuticle is the tiny little bit of hair, or not hair, tiny little bit of skin that hangs over the lanula. And so some people like to have a cuticle brush. They'll brush that to get dirt and stuff out of it to keep it healthy. Other people will actually take little, basically picks or shovels and shove that back in there. I've never understood why people do that. The nail bed is the part of your finger underneath your nail where the nail is attached to. And then we have the nail root. And you can't see that. The root, that fingernail, extends under your skin here. It extends a little ways, and the part that goes under your skin is the root. And so we can see in this diagram here, on the one on the right, that the skin comes up and it touches the nail there, but the nail extends a little bit further back. So where it extends back is the root. There are some other terms here, like the eponychium and the hyponychium. You do not need to know those terms. You need to know these terms. So, coming back to our directional terms, what is the most proximal part of a fingernail?
The root?
Yes. Why?
Because it's the closest to the shoulder.
Yeah. So the most proximal would mean closest to the shoulder. And so we're going to pick the part closest to my hand, which is the root. We go to the root, and then we have the body, and the body and the bed are in the same place. And then the cuticle is between them. So the root is the correct answer there. Now, the last thing to talk about is tissue repair or skin repair. Our skin is there for a lot of purposes, one of which is for protection. What are some other purposes you can think of for the skin, other than protection?
I guess so. We can have those nerves.
Yeah. So the nerves, the hair, all the stuff we learned about that lives in the skin has to have somewhere to live. And so if we have to have the skin so that we can have those other things. What else does our skin do? Temperature control, yes. And so this happens in a number of different ways. Number one, we sweat through our skin, right? So that helps control our temperature. Also, when we get hot, we will take our blood from our core and we'll move it out to our arms. And so if someone exercises, their face may get flush. Our body is moving the blood to our skin so that the heat is easier to escape. If we get cold, like I said before, something like your lips might turn blue because your body takes the blood and moves it into the interior of your body to conserve that heat. What else does the skin do? So we said it's for protection from damage. And so if I hit my arm, the skin is taking that. But what else is it protecting me from? So right now,
Being exposed.
somebody says bacteria. So yeah, pathogens, bacteria, virus, fungus. If I get COVID on my arm, that COVID on my arm, unless I go snort it, is not going to hurt me because it can't get through that skin. It prevents invaders from getting in. What might the skin prevent from getting out? This is a big problem. People who suffer from like widespread third-degree burns, they suffer from effects of this.
Dehydration.
Exactly. Yes. Dehydration. Thank you. The skin holds our water in. The outside part of our skin, number one, is dead cells with very little water in them. We also have a layer of oil. Water and oil don't mix, right? So it's difficult for the water to come up through the oil layer. But if we burn ourselves badly enough, and that third degree burn means that the skin is basically burned, it's gone. At that point, all the moisture, the water, the blood, everything in the muscle and the fat and everything underneath there is free to evaporate out. So that's really, really important. We take that for granted. But that and infections are what kill people who suffer from bad burns. I mean, if you can survive the burn itself, most people are going to die either from an infection because it lets bacteria or virus in, or they're going to die from dehydration. Now, if you're in a hospital, fortunately, you're probably not going to die of dehydration. But plenty of people do, unfortunately, die in hospitals of infections from burns. So let's go back to our initial function of skin, of manual protection. Prevents abrasion, scrapes, cuts, things like that. Our skin does get scratched and cut, right? There's no way around that. We have to fix that. If we get a cut, it doesn't just not heal, and by the time we're 30 or 50 or whatever, we're just covered in little cracks and everything. It heals. This is a multi-stage process. If you cut yourself to the point that you start bleeding, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to get a blood clot. If you get just a little paper cut and you don't bleed, at that point, that means that you've only cut through the epidermis, or you've only cut into the epidermis. Remember, there are no blood vessels in the epidermis. And so you have just a tiny little bit of wiggle room to cut yourself where you don't actually bleed. But remember, what were the cells or the cell structures that detected pain? Anybody remember? What detected pain?
The nociceptors.
The nociceptors, which are a type of free nerve ending. So everybody knows paper cuts hurt surprisingly a lot. It may actually hurt more to get a paper cut than to actually get cut, because the part of those nerve endings that are sensitive to pain are primarily the tips of them, which are up in the epidermis. If you get a paper cut in the epidermis, you're cutting the most sensitive part of that nerve. If you get a deeper cut, you're cutting the less sensitive inner part of those nerves. So let's imagine we have a deep cut here. We're bleeding because we've cut down into the dermis where there are blood vessels. So we get a blood clot. The blood clot happens due to proteins in our blood, in cells in our blood. We're not going to talk about the clotting process. You'll learn about that next semester. That's not important to us right now. We need to realize that we get a clot, and then we get a scab. So we get a clot, and then a scab. And then as we have that clot and scab, it's like a plug. It is plugging the hole and providing kind of a scaffold there. And so now the other cells around that cut can divide, multiply, and then kind of move into where the cut is, where the clot is, where the scab is, and continue to grow. And as they grow, they digest the clot, they digest the scab, and fill in the hole with skin cells. Eventually, the whole thing is filled, and the scab will fall off. More likely, though, you are impatient and you pick the scab off, and so if you do that, you'll see kind of pink under there, and it can be very, very sensitive to touch, because you are touching dermis at that point. The epidermis may not have fully repaired itself yet. You're touching live cells, and so it's going to hurt a little bit more. So that is wound repair in a nutshell. Don't worry too much about the fibroblasts and the fibers. I'm more worried about realizing the steps clotting and scab. The cells move in, and then they multiply and fill in the hole. Questions about that or anything else for the lecture?
Since we're talking about the repair, why is it that like when we do get scars or something, it's not the same way it was before? What kind of cells are those?
Very good. That's a very good question. So you're correct. Scar tissue, when we get a wound, it is actually never the same as it was before. It's like when you get in an accident in your car and you take it in to get it fixed, it's never the same. Right? It's more prone to rust, it's more prone to all kinds of stuff. So to answer your question, we'll go down and look at the bottom part, the part of the cells, with the cells that I told you to ignore. It says it's fibroblasts that come in and lay down fibers. Fibroblasts are cells that make fibers. Thinking about the cells that were there before we got cut, what kind of cells do you think those were? Doesn't have to be you. Anybody can answer.
I thought it was million.
So they're just normal epithelial cells, not fibroblasts. And so the cells that come in to fill the void aren't the same type of cell that was originally there. And so scar tissue is normally tougher. It's a different color. It doesn't look the same. It's different because it's not the same type of tissue. Now, usually, over time, over years and years, scars will tend to fade. And that is because eventually the epithelial cells will start to fill back in where the fibroblasts were. But that can take years and years and years. I don't know if you've seen any of the creams that you can buy that you're supposed to put it on, and you do it a couple times a day for a week or a month or whatever, and it's supposed to cause the scar to fade. What that is, there's something in there that causes the fibers, the kind of the glue that the fibroblasts made to fill in the gap. The cream will actually dissolve those, which makes more room for the epithelial cells to come in and make it look a little bit more normal.
Okay, like the stretch marks, I guess. Like, was that not the same with the skin stretching?
So it's similar. It's not exactly the same. So when we use the word scar, we refer to what we're really talking about is any kind of non-normal mark on our skin. But there's also scar tissue where if you get a cut and you see this looks different, usually scar tissue will kind of actually be raised up a little bit, whereas a stretch mark will actually come down a little bit. And so the stretch mark is usually a situation where the epidermis actually kind of rips sideways. Rather than getting cut, it rips sideways and exposes the dermis underneath. And at that point, rather than the epidermis coming back and making a straight layer again, it actually just kind of comes down and covers the dermis back up, but we still have that little bit of a ridge there. But we don't get these fibers that come in.
Okay.
Other questions? Okay. Well, that is it for today. So a fairly short day. I think some of our other lectures will be a little bit longer, but the integumentary system, there's just not that much there. And so unless anybody has any questions, you still have one more lecture before the next exam. But if you have not started doing your labs, I beg you, please start doing your lab. You do not want to wait until the last minute to do all of them. because you're going to have 2 exams that are due at the same time.
I do have one quick question. You said, oh, never mind. There's a range date between you can do the test. It's not one day. Okay.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Anything else? Okay. If you think of something, send me a message. We'll get it sorted out. Otherwise, I will see you next Tuesday. Have a good night.